Mariah woke up before the sun rose, as she did every single morning. Her small rented room was quiet, except for the sound of the neighbor's radio playing softly through the thin walls. She sat up on her old mattress, rubbed her tired eyes, and whispered a short prayer for strength to face another long day. Life was never easy for her, but she had learned to carry her burdens with quiet courage. She lived in a poor neighborhood on the edge of the city, where the streets were cracked and most of the houses leaned tiredly to one side. Still, Mariah's little corner of the world was always neat. She swept her doorstep every morning, watered the single plant she kept in a plastic bottle, and carried herself with dignity. Even though her income was barely enough to survive, she never allowed poverty to steal her pride. By the time the sky turned pale orange, Mariah was dressed in her clean maid's uniform. She kept it ironed, no matter how old it became, because she believed the way a person dressed showed respect for their work. She tied her hair neatly, packed a piece of bread into her small bag, and began her long walk to the bus stop. The air was cool, and children were already chasing each other in the streets. As she walked, she thought about her two younger siblings back home in the countryside. Her small earnings helped pay for their school books, and that thought alone gave her the strength to keep moving. Mariah worked for Richard Dalton, a man everyone in the city knew. He was a millionaire businessman who owned several companies and lived in one of the largest houses in the wealthiest part of town. His mansion was built with white stone and tall glass windows that gleamed in the sunlight. Whenever Mariah arrived, she felt like she was stepping into another world, a world that was too shiny, too perfect, and far from her own reality. But Mariah never allowed herself to feel small inside that house. She had worked there for nearly 5 years, and during that time she had proven herself trustworthy and reliable. She dusted every corner, polished every floor, and ensured that the house always smelled of lemon and lavender. She moved quietly, almost invisibly, so as not to disturb the family. That was the way of maids, always present, but rarely noticed. Despite her quietness, she had grown fond of one member of the family, Ethan, Richard Dalton's son. Ethan was a boy of about 8 years old, with a gentle smile that could melt anyone's heart. Unlike most rich children, Ethan never looked down on Mariah. He would often wave at her, talk to her while she worked, and even sneak into the kitchen to ask her for homemade snacks. In those moments, Mariah would smile warmly, for Ethan reminded her of her younger brother back home. Life inside the Dalton mansion was a mixture of luxury and distance. The family lived comfortably, surrounded by wealth, but they often seemed too busy to truly enjoy it. Richard Dalton was rarely home. His work kept him traveling from one meeting to another, always chasing the next deal. His wife, a graceful woman, was often occupied with social events and charity dinners. That left Ethan in the care of nannies, tutors, and though unofficially Mariah. It was Mariah who listened when Ethan wanted to share about his day. It was she who noticed when he looked pale or tired. She had seen him fall asleep on the sofa after playing too hard, and she had gently covered him with a blanket. She never said these things aloud, for she knew her place. She was not family. She was not even a nanny. She was only the maid. Yet, in her heart, she carried a quiet affection for the little boy. Mariah's own life was not free from struggle. Her wages were small, and most of it went to her siblings' education. She ate simple meals, walked long distances to save bus fare, and often patched her clothes instead of buying new ones. There were nights when she lay awake, wondering how long she could keep living like this. But every time despair tried to creep in, she reminded herself of why she worked, to give her family a better future. That thought gave her the courage to rise each morning. The Dalton mansion was filled with treasures Mariah could never imagine owning. A grand piano stood in the living room, though she never once saw anyone play it. Paintings hung on the walls, each worth more than her entire year's salary. And in the garage sat cars so shiny and rare that people stopped on the street just to take pictures. Among them, the red Ferrari always caught her eye. It was more than a car, it was a symbol of a world she could never reach. Sometimes, as she dusted the garage floor, she would pause for just a second to look at it, her reflection shining back from its flawless surface. But she always lowered her eyes quickly. That car did not belong to her world. Though she lived in the shadows of wealth, Mariah never let envy enter her heart. She accepted her role with grace. She believed that honest work, no matter how humble, carried its own kind of honor. She reminded herself that dusting the floors and washing the dishes were not signs of weakness, they were proof of her strength, of her ability to survive with dignity. People in her neighborhood often whispered that rich families did not truly care about their maids. They said maids were only tolerated, never respected. But Mariah never complained. She worked silently, even when her back ached, even when her hands grew rough from constant scrubbing. To her, complaining would not change her life, it would only make her spirit weaker. And yet, deep inside, she sometimes wondered what it would feel like to be truly seen. Not as the maid, not as the one who served in silence, but as a human being with a heart, with dreams, with courage. She had never imagined that a single night, one desperate choice, would make the entire city see her in a way no one ever had before. For now, though, Mariah's days passed in quiet rhythm. She arrived early, cleaned every room with care, and left late, walking back through the same tired streets to her little rented room. The world outside saw her as ordinary, invisible. But inside her lay a strength that was waiting for its moment, a strength that would one day shock everyone, even herself. The Dalton family was admired from the outside. To the world, they had everything: money, power, influence, and a lifestyle many could only dream of. Their mansion stood like a palace on the hill, surrounded by tall gates and bright gardens. Guests who came to visit always left in awe, speaking about the wealth and perfection they had seen. But inside the grand walls, not everything was as perfect as it appeared. Richard Dalton, the man at the center of it all, carried a weight heavier than anyone could see. He was a man of ambition, someone who had built his empire with sleepless nights and endless risks. People admired him for his success, but few understood the loneliness that followed him. His life was a constant race: meetings, deals, and endless phone calls. Even at home, his thoughts often stayed with his business. His wife, Grace, managed the house's appearances, attending social events and hosting dinners, but she too carried a hidden worry in her heart. Their son, Ethan, was the reason for that worry. To most people, Ethan looked like any other happy child. He smiled, laughed, and carried a gentle nature that won hearts easily. But behind his cheerful eyes was a struggle that only the family and the closest staff knew about. Ethan suffered from a rare medical condition, one that made his health fragile and unpredictable. Some days, he was perfectly fine, running around the garden and asking endless questions. On other days, he grew weak, pale, and tired, unable to even get out of bed. Doctors had warned the Daltons to always be careful. A sudden episode could become dangerous if help did not arrive in time. The family had done everything money could buy: specialists, medicine, equipment at home. Still, no amount of wealth could erase the fear that lived in their hearts every time Ethan coughed too hard or winced in pain. Mariah, though she was just the maid, had quietly become one of the people closest to Ethan. She never asked for it, it simply happened over time. While cleaning his room, she would notice the books he left open or the toys scattered on the floor. Ethan began to talk to her, first in little sentences, then in long conversations. Unlike the busy adults around him, Mariah always listened. She listened when he talked about his favorite stories, when he whispered his fears, and when he simply wanted someone to sit by his side. Over the years, their bond grew. Mariah's gentle nature seemed to comfort him in ways even the expensive nurses could not. She had no medical training, yet she carried the wisdom of a caring heart. She noticed his moods before anyone else. She knew when he needed rest, when he needed encouragement, and when he simply needed silence. It was as if she had become his quiet guardian, though no one officially gave her that role. There were times when Mariah would return to her small room at night, exhausted from work, and yet find herself thinking about Ethan. She worried about him the way an older sister would. She prayed for him before she prayed for herself. It wasn't her duty, but her heart did not know how to separate her feelings. Ethan's laughter had become a light in her tiring days, and his fragile health became her silent burden too. Richard Dalton, for all his success, sometimes felt powerless as a father. He loved his son deeply, yet work often pulled him away. There were nights when he sat alone in his office, staring at the reports in his hand but hearing only Ethan's weak voice in his memory. He questioned his choices, but he always returned to the same conclusion: he had to keep building, keep earning, to provide the best care money could buy. Grace, his wife, often tried to hide her worry behind smiles at social events. But in the privacy of her room, she sometimes cried quietly, praying for her child's future. Though the family never openly said it, Mariah sensed their fear. She saw it in the way Grace would rush to Ethan's side at the slightest cough. She saw it in Richard's eyes when he returned from a long trip and went straight to check on his son before even changing his suit. And she felt it in her own heart when she tucked Ethan's toys neatly into place, hoping he would be well enough to play with them again the next day. One afternoon, when Mariah was dusting the shelves in the living room, Ethan walked in holding a book in his small hands. He asked her to sit with him and read. Though it was not part of her duties, she sat down beside him and began to read aloud in her soft voice. Ethan leaned against her shoulder, smiling at the sound of her words. For that moment, the grand mansion felt less like a palace and more like a home. Mariah often thought about how different her world was from Ethan's. She came from poverty, from streets where even a pair of shoes was considered a gift. Ethan came from a mansion where even the smallest toy was more expensive than she could ever afford. And yet, in their conversations, those differences disappeared. They laughed at silly stories, shared thoughts about the stars, and sometimes even sat in silence, just enjoying the company of someone who cared. The other staff sometimes whispered about how close Ethan was to Mariah. Some thought it strange that a boy born into wealth preferred the company of a maid over his tutors or playmates. But those whispers never mattered. To Ethan, Mariah was not the maid. She was the person who truly saw him not as a patient, not as the rich man's son, but simply as a boy who wanted love and understanding. Richard Dalton, though always busy, noticed this bond from time to time. At first, he felt uneasy. He wondered if it was proper for a maid to be so close to his son. But then he saw the change in Ethan, the comfort in his eyes when Mariah was near, the laughter that returned when she listened to him, the peace that seemed to surround him in her presence. Richard never said anything aloud, but deep inside, he felt a quiet gratitude for Mariah's care. Still, he could not escape the fear that lived in his chest. He knew that one day, Ethan's condition might strike without warning. He had already experienced nights where he rushed to the hospital in panic, his heart racing faster than his car. That fear never truly left him. It followed him to meetings, into his dreams, into the silence of the night. And though he had prepared everything money could buy, he also knew that sometimes, fate did not listen to wealth. Mariah sensed that too. She had seen the doctors come and go. She had watched Ethan struggle to catch his breath, and she had stood quietly in the hallway while the family rushed around in panic. In those moments, she wished she could do more. But she was just the maid, and all she could offer was her presence, her prayers, and her love. None of them knew that soon, a night would come when Ethan's life would hang by a thread. None of them knew that in that desperate hour, it would not be money, not doctors, not even the father's power that would decide Ethan's fate. It would be Mariah, the maid who was never truly seen, the woman who carried quiet courage in her heart, who would make a choice that would change everything. The night began quietly, almost too quietly. The Dalton mansion glowed softly under the moonlight, its tall windows reflecting the stars above. Inside, the halls were still. Most of the staff had already gone home, leaving only a few workers for the night. Mariah was in the kitchen, finishing up her last tasks. She washed the final dishes, wiped the counters, and prepared to head to her small quarters on the edge of the estate. It had been an ordinary day, and she expected the night to pass the same way. But life has a way of turning ordinary moments into unforgettable ones. Upstairs, Ethan had been reading before bed. He had insisted earlier that he felt fine, though Mariah had noticed a certain tiredness in his eyes. She didn't say anything, but her heart whispered a prayer for his strength. As the mansion grew quiet, the boy lay down to sleep, his book still open beside him. Grace, his mother, had checked on him once, kissed his forehead, and gone to her room to prepare for the next morning's charity event. Richard was still away in the city, finishing a late meeting that had dragged on longer than planned. Then it happened. Sometime past midnight, Ethan stirred in his bed. At first, it was only a cough, light and harmless. But within moments, the cough deepened. His small chest began to rise and fall unevenly. He tried to call for his mother, but his voice was weak. Fear filled his eyes as he realized something was very wrong. Mariah, just as she was about to blow out her lamp, heard the faint sound through the walls. It wasn't unusual for Ethan to cough, but something about this sound chilled her. Without hesitation, she left her small room and hurried upstairs. When she opened the door to Ethan's room, her heart nearly stopped. The boy was gasping, his face pale, his hands clutching the blanket tightly. "Ethan!" Mariah rushed to his side, her own breath quickening. She called out for help, her voice echoing down the hallway. Grace appeared moments later, her silk robe trailing behind her, eyes wide with fear. She ran to her son, holding his trembling hand. "Call the doctor!" Grace cried out. One of the remaining staff dialed the emergency number immediately. But the response they received made the panic even worse. The operator explained that heavy traffic and an accident on the main road were delaying ambulances in that area. They promised to send one as soon as possible, but they could not give an exact time. Grace's hands shook. She tried to stay calm, but tears welled in her eyes. "He can't wait," she whispered. "He can't wait that long." Mariah's heart pounded in her chest. She knew Ethan's condition well enough to understand the danger. If they didn't get him to the hospital quickly, the consequences could be unthinkable. She looked around desperately, searching for an answer. That was when her eyes fell on the key stand by the hallway. Among the polished brass hooks hung a set of keys she knew very well, the keys to Richard Dalton's red Ferrari. The car that shone brighter than anything she had ever seen. The car that was always spoken of with pride and admiration. The car she had only ever touched when wiping dust from its surface. Her breath caught in her throat. A thought crossed her mind so daring, so impossible, that she almost pushed it away. But then she looked back at Ethan, his lips trembling, his breathing shallow. There was no time to wait. Mariah turned to Grace, her voice trembling but strong. "We can't wait for the ambulance. I can drive him. I will take him to the hospital now." Grace froze, staring at her. The idea seemed unthinkable. A maid behind the wheel of the most valuable car in the mansion? It was madness. But another sharp gasp from Ethan broke her hesitation. Desperation leaves no room for rules. "Go!" Grace cried, her voice breaking. "Take him. Please, just save him." Without another word, Mariah grabbed the keys. She lifted Ethan gently into her arms, the boy's small body trembling against her chest. With Grace by her side, they rushed through the silent halls of the mansion and out to the garage. The Ferrari stood there, gleaming even in the dim light, as if it were waiting. Mariah had never driven such a car in her life. She had only seen cars like this in magazines or passing by on the streets. Her own life had been filled with walking, crowded buses, and the occasional ride in an old taxi. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, she had no choice. Her hands shook as she slid into the driver's seat. The leather felt strange under her fingers, too soft, too perfect. Grace carefully placed Ethan in the back seat, whispering soothing words to him. His eyes fluttered, but his breathing was weak. Mariah pressed the start button, and the car roared to life. The sound filled the garage like thunder. For a second, she froze, her heart racing with fear not of the car, but of what she was about to do. If Richard Dalton found out, she could lose her job, her reputation, everything she had worked for. But then she looked at Ethan through the rearview mirror. His fragile chest rose unevenly, and in that moment, her fear vanished. She gripped the steering wheel tightly and pressed down on the accelerator. The Ferrari surged forward, its power unlike anything she had ever known. The tires screeched as she turned sharply onto the empty road. The night air rushed past them, cool and sharp. The city lights blurred as the car sped faster and faster. Mariah's eyes stayed fixed on the road, her knuckles white on the wheel. She had never driven like this before, but desperation guided her hands. Every second mattered. Every red light, every turn, every corner became a test of courage. Grace sat in the back, holding Ethan close, whispering prayers through her tears. "Stay with me, Ethan. Just a little longer. We're almost there." Mariah pushed the car harder, weaving through the streets with a focus she didn't know she had. The Ferrari's engine roared like a beast, carrying them forward with unstoppable force. People on the sidewalks turned their heads, astonished at the sight of the red blur racing through the night. In her mind, Mariah thought of nothing else but the boy's life. She didn't care about the car. She didn't care about the risk. She didn't care about herself. All she knew was that a child's heart was beating weaker with every moment, and she was the only one who could carry him to safety. Finally, the glowing lights of the hospital appeared in the distance. Relief flooded her chest, but she dared not slow down. She pulled into the emergency entrance with a screech, the car stopping just as doctors and nurses rushed forward. Grace leapt out, crying for help, while Mariah opened the back door and lifted Ethan into her arms once more. "Please, help him," she cried, her voice breaking. The medical team took Ethan swiftly, rushing him inside. Grace followed, her sobs echoing in the halls. Mariah stood frozen for a moment, her chest heaving from fear and adrenaline. Her hands still shook from gripping the wheel. She had just done the unthinkable. She had stolen a millionaire's prized Ferrari. But as she watched the doctors surround Ethan, working quickly to save him, she knew she would do it all over again if it meant giving him another breath. She had no idea what would happen next, whether she would be punished, whether Richard Dalton would fire her, or even call the police. None of that mattered. All that mattered was that Ethan was alive, and she had done what she had to do. The hospital was alive with urgency. Bright lights shone down the long hallways, nurses moved quickly, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed against the clean floors. In one of the emergency rooms, Ethan lay surrounded by doctors. Machines beeped steadily, marking each fragile heartbeat. Grace sat just outside the room, her hands trembling, her face pale from fear. She had cried until her eyes were swollen, whispering prayers under her breath. Mariah sat on a bench nearby, her uniform wrinkled, her hair undone from the rush. Her hands were still shaking from driving the Ferrari, and her heart was heavy with questions. Had she done the right thing? Would Ethan survive? And when Richard Dalton arrived, what would he do to her? It wasn't long before the sound of hurried footsteps filled the hall again. Richard Dalton stormed through the hospital doors, his expensive suit slightly crumpled from his late-night meeting. His face was stern, his jaw tight, and his eyes searching for answers. He moved quickly toward his wife, who rose to meet him. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice low but urgent. "Where is Ethan?" Grace threw herself into his arms, her words tumbling out in broken pieces. "It happened so fast, he couldn't breathe, the ambulance didn't come. Mariah, she drove him here." At the sound of that name, Richard stiffened. His sharp eyes turned toward the quiet figure sitting on the bench. Mariah lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. Her heart pounded as though it wanted to escape her chest. She had been preparing herself for this moment since the second she turned the key in the Ferrari. Richard walked toward her, each step heavy with tension. His face was unreadable, caught between fury, shock, and fear. Mariah stood up quickly, her knees weak, and whispered, "Sir, is it true?" Richard's voice cut through the hallway. "You took my car." Mariah swallowed hard. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to answer honestly. "Yes, sir. I did. I know it was wrong, but Ethan couldn't wait." Her words caught in her throat. "I just wanted to save him." The hallway fell silent. Nurses passing by slowed their steps, sensing the tension. Grace stood nearby, tears still on her cheeks, watching the scene unfold. Richard's eyes burned into Mariah's. For years, he had trusted her to work quietly in his home, to clean and care without stepping beyond her place. And now, she had crossed the boldest line, driving his most prized possession without permission. To many, it would be unforgivable. Mariah's hands twisted nervously in front of her. She knew what he was thinking. She had no excuse. She had taken something that didn't belong to her. She braced herself for anger, for dismissal, perhaps even for the police. But then Richard's gaze shifted. Beyond Mariah, through the glass window, he saw his son lying on the hospital bed, machines beeping steadily, doctors working with care. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. He simply stood there, his shoulders heavy, his chest rising and falling with unspoken emotion. Grace stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "Richard, she saved him. If it weren't for Mariah, Ethan might not be alive right now. The ambulance couldn't make it in time." She didn't think of herself, she didn't think of the car, she thought only of our son. Richard's jaw tightened. He turned back to Mariah, who still stood with her head bowed, waiting for her punishment. But instead of shouting, instead of unleashing the anger she expected, Richard asked a single question. "Why?" Mariah lifted her eyes slowly, surprised by the softness in his tone. Tears filled her vision, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "Because he's just a boy I've cared for every day. I couldn't stand by and watch him suffer. I don't have much, sir. I don't have money, I don't have power. But I had your car in front of me, and I had a choice. I knew it was not mine to touch, but I also knew a life mattered more than anything else." Her words hung in the air, heavy and honest. Richard stared at her, his expression unreadable. Inside him, two worlds clashed: the strict businessman who valued rules, and the desperate father who nearly lost his son. He thought about the Ferrari, the car he had cherished, the symbol of his success. Then he thought about Ethan's small hand gripping his finger when he was born, the laughter that filled their home on good days, and the fragile boy now lying in a hospital bed. The truth hit him harder than any business deal ever could. The car was only metal and paint. His son's life was everything. Slowly, Richard exhaled. The tension in his shoulders eased, and for the first time that night, his eyes softened. He stepped closer to Mariah, and instead of anger, there was gratitude in his voice. "You risked everything," he said quietly. "Your job. Your safety. Even your dignity. All for him." Mariah's lips trembled. "I would do it again, sir. 1,000 times. No car, no wealth, no rule is greater than a child's life." Grace covered her mouth with her hand, tears rolling down her cheeks. Nurses nearby exchanged glances, astonished by the scene before them. No one expected a millionaire to show restraint. No one expected a maid to speak with such courage. Richard stood silently for a long moment, his eyes locked on Mariah's. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. "You did the right thing." Mariah blinked, hardly believing what she had heard. Relief rushed through her, and her knees nearly gave way. She expected anger, but instead she found understanding. Richard turned back toward the window, his eyes fixed on Ethan. His voice was quieter now, almost as if speaking to himself. If I had been here, if I hadn't been stuck in another meeting, maybe it wouldn't have come to this. Grace touched his arm gently. Don't blame yourself, Richard. What matters is that Ethan is alive. And it's because of her. She glanced toward Mariah, her eyes filled with respect. Mariah lowered her gaze, humbled by their words. She had not acted for praise. She had not acted for reward. She had acted because her heart gave her no other choice. When the doctor finally stepped out of the emergency room, everyone rushed forward. He's stable now, the doctor said, his voice calm but firm. It was close, but he's strong. He'll need rest and continued care, but he's going to be all right. Grace wept openly, her body shaking with relief. Richard closed his eyes and exhaled, a single tear escaping despite his efforts to remain composed. For the first time in a long while, he felt the true weight of gratitude, not for his wealth, not for his success, but for the people who had stood by his son in his moment of need. He turned once more to Mariah. She stood quietly, still unsure of her place, her hands folded before her. Richard stepped closer, his voice steady. You didn't just save my son. You saved me from losing everything that truly matters. I will never forget this. Mariah's throat tightened, and though she wanted to speak, no words came. All she could do was nod, tears finally falling freely down her cheeks. That night, the story spread quietly through the hospital staff. A maid had driven a millionaire's Ferrari through the city to save his son. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered with admiration. And while Richard Dalton's reaction shocked everyone, no one could deny one simple truth: Mariah's courage had changed everything. The morning sun rose slowly over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Inside the hospital, the long night of fear and panic gave way to quiet relief. Ethan lay peacefully in his bed, his small chest rising and falling steadily. Machines hummed softly beside him, but the danger had passed. For the first time in hours, Grace allowed herself to smile, brushing her son's hair gently as he slept. Richard Dalton sat nearby, his usually stern face softened with exhaustion and gratitude. The powerful man who had spent years controlling business empires now sat quietly, humbled by how close he had come to losing the one thing money could never replace. He kept glancing toward Ethan, as though reminding himself that the boy was truly still alive. Mariah, though deeply tired, remained in the corner of the room. She did not want to intrude on the family's moment, yet her heart would not allow her to leave until she was certain Ethan was safe. She had not closed her eyes all night, but she felt no regret. Every risk, every fear, every moment behind the wheel of that roaring car had been worth it. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses whispered the story in the hallways, and soon visitors began to speak of it too. A maid driving a millionaire's Ferrari in the middle of the night to save his son. It sounded like something from a movie, yet it was true. By the time the morning shift began, the story had already reached beyond the hospital walls. Back at the mansion, the staff who had remained behind shared their own version of the tale. Some could hardly believe it, others shook their heads in amazement. For years, Mariah had worked quietly in the shadows, rarely noticed, rarely spoken of. Now, her name was on everyone's lips. But Mariah herself thought of none of that. She sat quietly, her eyes often fixed on Ethan. When he finally opened his eyes and gave a weak smile, her heart swelled with relief. "You're safe now," she whispered softly, tears filling her eyes. Ethan reached for her hand with his small fingers, and in that simple touch, every fear of the night seemed to fade away. Later that morning, Richard stepped out of the hospital room to make a phone call. When he returned, his expression was firm but calm. He motioned for Mariah to step outside with him. Nervously, she followed, her hands twisting together as she braced herself for what he might say. For a long moment, Richard stood silently, his eyes fixed on the morning light streaming through the hospital windows. Then he turned to her. "Mariah," he began, his voice steady, "I know what you risked last night. You could have lost your job. You could have been arrested. You could have been hurt. And yet, you thought of none of that. You thought only of saving my son." Mariah lowered her gaze. "Sir, I only did what anyone would have done." Richard shook his head slowly. "No. Not everyone would have done what you did. Most would have waited, afraid of the consequences. But you chose courage over fear. And because of that, Ethan is alive." Mariah's eyes filled with tears again. She wanted to reply, but words failed her. Richard continued, his voice softer now. "Last night, I realized something. For years, I've surrounded myself with wealth, with things that shine and impress the world. But in the end, it wasn't the cars, the house, or the money that saved my son. It was you. A woman who had nothing to gain, but everything to lose." Mariah blinked rapidly, stunned by his words. She had never expected such recognition, especially from a man like Richard Dalton. He took a deep breath. "From this day forward, you are not just a maid in my house. You are part of this family. Whatever you need, whatever your family needs, I will make sure you have it. You've earned more than my respect. You've earned my trust, my gratitude, and my promise that you will never be invisible again." Mariah gasped softly, her heart pounding in disbelief. She had expected anger, perhaps even dismissal. Instead, she was being lifted into a place of honor she had never imagined for herself. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she whispered, "Thank you, sir, but I did not do it for reward. I did it because Ethan he is precious." Richard nodded, his own eyes glistening. "And that is why you deserve everything." When they returned to the room, Grace embraced Mariah tightly, something she had never done before. "You saved my son," she said through tears. "No words will ever be enough." In the days that followed, the story spread beyond the mansion and the hospital. Newspapers picked it up, amazed at the courage of a poor maid who had dared to take a millionaire's Ferrari in a desperate race against time. Neighbors whispered it on the streets, strangers discussed it in cafes, and soon it became a story that touched the hearts of people far and wide. Many were shocked not only by Mariah's bravery, but by Richard Dalton's response. Instead of punishment, he had chosen gratitude. Instead of anger, he had chosen honor. And in that choice, he revealed that wealth was not measured by possessions, but by humanity. Back at the Dalton mansion, life slowly returned to normal, though nothing truly felt the same. Ethan grew stronger each day, and his laughter once again filled the halls. But there was a new warmth in the house now. The walls that once felt distant and cold began to echo with a different kind of love. Mariah's role changed too. No longer was she simply the maid who moved silently through the rooms. She was invited to family dinners, included in conversations, and trusted with responsibilities far greater than before. Richard even arranged for her siblings in the countryside to receive better education, lifting a weight from her shoulders she had carried for years. And yet, despite all the changes, Mariah remained the same humble woman she had always been. She still rose early each morning, still carried herself with dignity, and still poured her heart into every task. But now, she did so with a lighter spirit, knowing she was seen, valued, and respected. Sometimes, when she passed the garage and saw the red Ferrari, she would pause for a moment. The car no longer seemed like an unreachable dream. To her, it was a reminder not of wealth, but of the night courage mattered more than rules, and love mattered more than fear. Ethan, too, never forgot. As he grew older, he often told the story proudly to anyone who would listen. "Mariah saved my life," he would say, his eyes shining. And each time he said it, Mariah's heart filled with quiet joy. The world might have seen her as just a maid, but to Ethan and to the Dalton family, she was far more. She was the woman who had risked everything in the darkest hour, and in doing so, had taught them all the true meaning of courage, love, and loyalty. And so, what began as a night of fear became a story of hope, a story that shocked everyone, not because a Ferrari was taken, but because a humble woman's heart shone brighter than any treasure money could buy.